Major funding for these broadcasts has been provided by grants from Madison Realty Capital, New York Community Bank, M&T Bank, AmTrust Title, Customers Bank, Ariel Property Advisors, Capital One Bank, Sterling National Bank, Marks Paneth LLP, Meridian Capital Group. Additional funding has been provided by grants from Amarant Bank, AVR Realty Company, Bank of America Merrill Lynch, Briarwood Organization, B6 Real Estate Advisors, CBRE, Chase Commercial Term Lending, Chase Mortgage Lending, Citizens Bank, Collins Building Services, CPEX Real Estate Services, Douglaston Development, Levine Builders, Flushing Bank, Friedman LLP, Handro Properties Handler Real Estate Organization, Hodges Ward Elliott INC, Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, John Casamatidis Red Apple Group, Kilroy Architectural Windows, Matone Group, Newmark Knight Frank, Optimum Window Manufacturing Corp., People's United Bank, Rockefeller Group, Rosewood Realty Group, RPW Group, SJP Properties, Stonehenge NYC, TD Bank, Terra CRG, the Merringore Family Foundation, and these friends. Brooklyn, New York. Now, he put together newspapers. He became a deli man. You know, he was in the SP. I can't believe this. And, you know, went to Queens College, played football, went to City College, became an architect, became a developer, became originally a contractor, then a developer. A great human being, and my friend Jeff Levine. Thanks for being here.
I appreciate the great human being part of what you said.
Okay, a mensch is the real comment. So tell me about your dad's side, how they arrived, and then mom's side.
So a topic very appropriate for today's world we're living in. My grandparents on both my mother's and my father's side of the family were immigrants from Eastern Europe. After the First World War, my father's mother and father, my Zadie Joe and my Bubby Lily, both came here to the United States independent from one another. They actually were married through an arranged marriage. And my father was the middle of three sons who were raised in Brooklyn in the Depression era. My grandparents became separated. There was no such thing as divorce then. There was nothing to divorce about because there was no money. My grandmother, my Bubby Lily, basically did laundry and tailoring in the apartment to help support her three sons.
That's on your father's side?
That's on my father's side, yes.
Okay, and mom's side?
My mom's side, also my Zadie Benny, for whom my son is named after, Benjamin, and my Bubby Hannah, both came here, separated from their families again after the First World War. They lost much of their family in Europe through the Holocaust, but came here. My Zadie, during the Second World War, had a small grocery or bodega type store in Rockaway. He had an uncanny capacity to do numbers in his head, I guess, from selling nickel and dime items and doing the math. Didn't even need to write them on the brown paper bag. And he ultimately worked for a company which was known as, I think it was Messings or Pechters, which was
right, the kosher cakes, kosher bakeries.
Kosher bakers for both the year as well as for Passover.
So Dad's born in the 30s, I remember, 1933?
1932, may he rest in peace. He just passed away this year.
Dad grows up in Brooklyn and subsequently goes into the Korean War.
He
Right.
was drafted into the Army during the time of the Korean War. He was stationed in Fort Hood in Killeen, Texas, I believe. My mother went down with him on the train after they were married in, I guess it was June, in New York. Then went with him to Fort Hood, Texas. And after a few months, she wasn't feeling well. She went to the doctor and she learned she was pregnant. And so she rushed back home to New York, where I was born in Brooklyn. My father continued to serve in the military, was stationed in Germany during the time of the Korean War. And I always used to kibitz with my dad that by staying overseas in the military, he managed not to change a single diaper for me as a child. My mother came home to New York, and it was a difficult period for her. My mother, Irene, as you may know, you've met her, is a saint of a woman. She came back, gave birth to me, and at the same time, my bubby Hannah was afflicted with a brain tumor and went into surgery and came out, thank God, mentally well, but physically an invalid for the balance of her life. My mother took care of me as an infant, my grandmother as an invalid, and she was 15 years older. She was only 20 years old when she gave birth to me. She was 15 years older than my Uncle Shelley, who she helped raise, essentially.
How'd Mom meet Dad?
So it's really a very funny story. As I said, my mother was a twin sister. She and my aunt were celebrating their sweet 16. My aunt was already dating my Uncle Al, who she's still married to some 60 years later. And my father was invited by my Uncle Al, who he knew from his, I think it was Brooklyn Vocational High School at the time, and went as to meet my mother at that Sweet 16. And they met, and as I told you, within a few years, they were engaged and married, and before he went off to the military.
Now, when your dad comes back, he goes into business with your mother's father, right?
Not initially. When he first came back from service, he had a number of different jobs, one of which was a milkman in the Brooklyn neighborhood where we lived. Another of which was he had an uncle on my father's side, a cousin to my bubby Lily, who was in the haberdashery business. He sold door-to-door garments, mostly working garments, but that really wasn't for him. And as time moved on, after these various occupations, he, my Zadie Benny, my mother's father, as well as my Uncle Al, all bought taxicab medallions back in, I guess it must have been around 1960.
Okay, you're born, as we said, in Brooklyn, even though Dad was away, Mom was here. You lived initially where?
My mother came back from Fort Hood in Texas. We moved in with my grandparents on my mother's side. It was on 96th Street in Brooklyn, off of Church Avenue. When my father came back, my parents rented an apartment over on Herzl Street in New Lots, which was East Flatbush, Brownsville area. We lived there until we moved into 215 Cozine Avenue, which was at the Linden Houses, the NYCHA projects in East New York, Brooklyn. And I was there until I went into the second or third grade in high school, in public school. I started at public school 190, and then I moved over to public school 219 on the same block that my grandparents had lived at 96th and Church. And it was a wonderful childhood. I remember being bar mitzvahed in Brooklyn at the Avenue O Jewish Center. And then we bought two-family homes. When I say we, my father, my grandparents, and my Uncle Al and my Aunt Evelyn. We all lived like a shtetl. We moved from Brooklyn to Queens en masse, and we lived in two-family homes adjacent to one another in the Douglaston section of Queens, which is how I eventually came up with the Douglaston Development name for my development company.
So let's talk about growing up as a kid in Brooklyn and Queens.
So moving from Brooklyn to Queens, I lived in what were predominantly Jewish and Italian neighborhoods. In Queens, I initially went to work at the local luncheonette. on the Sunday morning newspapers, I would go in early and assemble the newspapers,
Right,
the
but
New
one
York
day
Times.
you became the short order cook.
Well,
right?
basically what happened is there was a short order chef in the luncheonette, fellow by the name of Cecil. One Sunday morning, Cecil didn't show up. And the fellow who owned the luncheon, his name was Sonny, he said, "Jeff, poof, you're a short order chef this morning." I went behind the counter, and I did great. I did great until somebody ordered eggs Benedict. I had no idea what that was and no idea how to make it. So they walked me through it, and somehow we survived.
You grew up in a neighborhood with the Jews and Italians, and there was a heavy amount of people who were in the construction business. So you learned the concrete business.
So again, many of my friends' fathers were in the construction trades. So during the summers of my high school, I started working in the various trades. First, my high school buddy Joey Mastrantoni and I worked for his uncle, Preferred Roofing and Siding, and we did roofing and siding. And then my other buddy, Frank Paoluzzi, his father and his uncles were in the concrete business, and I went to work for N&L Concrete. And frankly speaking, I found the calling. I very much enjoyed the physical outdoor labor. I was physically a big guy. I enjoyed the work, and I enjoyed the sense of accomplishment of creating something. So those hard summers working in the concrete trade showed me that I had an affinity for the business. And from that, I actually went to work. When I graduated high school, I started at Queens College, and after a series of events, I transferred over to
City College
School of Architecture at night, over 133rd Street and Broadway by the L. And I before I answered Ed, one of the members of my synagogue, Marathon Jewish Community Center, where my parents are very active, was in the construction business as a general contractor. And I went to work for him as, I'll call myself a chief cook and bottle washer. And I became more exposed to the business of building, and I found my calling.
So you graduated City College in what year?
I graduated City College in 1975, and if you recall, that period post-1974, when our illustrious President Ford basically had the headline at the front page of the New York Post in New York, which said something which I should not say,
right.
Drop dead, New York was not a wonderful place to find the job. At that point, I had a couple of opportunities, one of which was to go into the South Bronx for a demolition contractor, where a part of the job required possibly holding a firearm, and I didn't think that was something I wanted to do. I also was offered work in Houston at the oil patch, but moving to Houston away from my family and friends and city that I love was not in the cards either. So I answered an ad in the New York Times. I was one of 350 calls for a small classified ad to work as an assistant construction super in the organization of the developer Herb Mandel back in, as I said, 1975 or 74 actually. I got the job, and I went to work for the sum initially of $250 a week, working on the major gut rehabs of a number of very prominent buildings in the city of New York.
You failed to mention that the reason you got the job is the wife.
Well, it was actually not Mr. Mandel's wife, but the wife of Bob Oken, and his wife, Sonny, basically said there were 350 calls, and she said, "I think you should give the job to this young fella, Jeff. He sounds like a nice Jewish boy."
You get involved with the renovation of 88 Lex, 90 Lexington Avenue, get involved with the city projects, the rehab projects, and then at the age of what, 29?
No, 25.
25.
It was in 79. So after working for Mandel and going through some major projects, you mentioned 88, 90 Lex under the J51 tax abatement program, renovated into multifamily resi from commercial office. We then renovated what was the former hotel, the Paris Hotel and Health Club, into, again, under the J51 tax abatement apartments. And at that point, things were winding down for that organization, and I was faced with an option. I was offered a number of jobs by a number of major developers and contractors, but at that time I was 25 years old. I did not yet have a wife and children, as I was blessed to have in the future, and I basically said, I'm going to go in business. And I hung up a shingle. I didn't really know too many people. I didn't know too many things, but I knew how to survive. And I took some small projects right out of the gate, and I did well initially, well enough to bring my company to the attention of other developers who were looking for capable general contractors. And I started to do work for various developers, some of them private sector, some of them having to do with the City of New York's vacant building and participation loan programs.
So when did you meet Harry Suna?
Okay, so it's very interesting. So I had been working with some subcontractors who, when I went on my own, introduced me to owners who were looking for capable contractors. And two flooring fellas, by Action Flooring was the name of the company, Bernie Mundry and Al Sherman, introduced me to Harry Suna, who was looking for a capable contractor.
Who was in the sheet metal business, but also in the building.
Harry was primarily one of the largest sheet metal contractors in New York at the time. I believe he did the original World Trade Towers. He was active in the participation loan program, renovating buildings under these programs in the Bronx, particularly on Brady Avenue. I met Harry. I was given the opportunity to work for him as a contractor, and we literally were physically on the roofs of these burnt buildings up in the Bronx, hanging with standards that would not be acceptable today, and rebuilding the patent roofs and so on. So it was quite an experience. After a while, my business started to flourish, and I used to say Harry was very smart, but didn't let you make too much money. So I started to work for other developers and other clients who actually let me make a living. When I got a call back from Harry Suna a few years later, he said, Jeff, come meet with me. And I went to meet with him. And he said, listen, I don't want you to be a contractor. I'd like you to be a partner in this project. He had been designated a very large vacant building program project up on Woody Crest and Anderson, up in the Bronx, in the High Bridge section. And I, in exchange for participating as the contractor, along with him, was given an ownership interest in the development. And that, along with my dear friend Arthur Leeds, with whom I've done many jobs through the years, who also had been designated a project. In this case, it was up on Tudor and Walton in the section of the Bronx just above Yankee Stadium. When I went to business, I was also fortunate. A fellow by the name of Arnie Gumowitz, who I had met actually through the fellow I had worked for, who was his next door neighbor. Arnie had been in the schmata business and then translated over to the real estate ownership and development business. So initially, Arnie had bought a building which is on the corner of 33rd Street and 7th Avenue by Penn Station, and it was in need of repair. And he contracted with me to renovate the common areas of the floors of that building by ripping out the ceiling, the lighting, the doors, the frames. So I went to work for Arnie doing that project, and I required doors, frames, and hardware. So I called up K&D Door and Frame, the Sklar family, who I had been ordering literally hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of material as an employee of my previous employer. And I told Victor I'd like to have X numbers, doors, frames, hardware delivered to this location at this time. And Victor says to me, Jeffrey, will that be certified check or cash? I said, Victor, it's Jeffrey Levine. He says, yes, I know that. But you're now Jeffrey Levine ordering for Jeffrey Levine. Yesterday, you were Jeffrey Levine ordering for the Mandel organization. So I very quickly went to my banks, I withdrew whatever cash I have, and I was able to pay him the cash as necessary. So it's a valuable lesson you learn. There's a very big difference between working for somebody else and being on your own when, as they say, the buck stops here.
So how did you meet Randy?
Oh, so in a similar circumstance, I had been buying lumber from a lovely gentleman by the name of David Bogart, who owned Tiffany Lumber in the Bronx. And when I went on my own, I continued to buy material from him. And he was a gentleman who was a lovely fellow, big family man, big sports fan. And we had become friendly. He was a few years older than I was. And it turns out that when his son was being bar mitzvahed at the Belrose Jewish Center, which was not far from where I lived in Queens, he invited me to his son's bar mitzvah. And unbeknownst to me, his wife's college friend was the mother of my wife-to-be, Randy Beth Charno, now Levine. We met at the bar mitzvah, and we had a romance that resulted in our having been married in a short 2 years later.
when you were in business and after the birth of your son Benjamin, the story with Olive Freeberg.
I've been very blessed, as I said to you. I married a wonderful woman, Randy, who has been an extraordinary wife and an incredible parent to my 3 beautiful children. My son Benjamin, who you know has been working with me for 10 years and is in love with the business. My daughter Jessica, who just gave me my first grandchild along with her husband
grandchild's
Evan.
name?
Her name is Orly, and she is everything you ever imagine in a granddaughter. My daughter Dara, who is a teacher in New York City working with children with disabilities, and she is a blessing as well. So I've been blessed on many counts. So going back in the early days, there was no fax machines to my recollection. I certainly didn't have a brochure, and I was recommended to this Alan Freeberg in connection with a project that he was going to build down in the meatpacking district, which was not the meatpacking district we know today, but a very different place 35 years ago. Having said that, I had no brochure. He asked me to write something about my company, and I did, but I included a picture of my newborn son, and I put in a little balloon which said, "Help feed me." So I very often tell the story about what a marketing gorilla I am by quoting that story where I sent the picture of my newborn son with a request to help feed him as part of my marketing effort to get Mr. Freeberg to give me that project. And we did that project successfully, as well as some others over the course of the time with him as a client.
There was a change from when it was Levine Builders to Douglaston Development. Yeah. And I think a number of those things relate to a couple of projects with only like 5 minutes left. One of the projects was the 116th Street with the Suna family, Renaissance Plaza, right?
Right.
Tell me about that quickly.
Well, I had been spending my time as a contractor, and as I worked for other developers and then became partners with those developers after I had been working for them as a contractor, I very quickly learned how to be a developer myself by being involved in the process. Having been the case, I was doing development both in the new homes program with the city of Newark.
Right, that was the Anchor project.
Well, the Anchor project was HPD as well as the partnership, but originally the new homes program, we built 2 family homes in Brooklyn and Bronx and all over the city for sale under that program. And then we also did the Anchor program, as you mentioned. Then I had the privilege of doing the Cornerstone program in partnership with Mr. Litwin and his organization.
On 102nd Street and First Avenue.
Exactly. Right? And I learned very quickly that I was earning 90% of my living as a developer and spending less of my time on my development work than I was as a contractor working on other people's projects, earning far less of my living.
So we had the 116th Street Limited Income Co-op. Then you had the Cameo, 50th Street and 8th Avenue.
Right.
Which was a turning point because it was right after 9/11.
It was a turning point in many ways. The Cameo on 311 West 50th was one of the first market rate development I did as a developer without partners, more or less. And as you know, I was completing the project in the fall of '01 when the terrible tragedy of 9/11 occurred. And I thought, well, I'm out of business. I had a full recourse loan to a major commercial bank. We now have a psychology of fear and the thought of an exodus of jobs. Lo and behold, it didn't happen. New York City thrived in the aftermath of 9/11, and I was able to refinance that building and survive and go on. And that gave me a confidence in the city of New York that enabled me to tie up not only the waterfront of Williamsburg in a rezoning effort, but I made big commitments to the Hudson Yards areas as well as
the Elm, which was built before Hudson Yards.
Exactly. So we, as a result of the fact that I saw how resilient New York City was, I renewed my commitment, and I continue to buy New York City when it affords you the opportunity for market rate projects. And something which we talked about briefly, over the last 40 years, we have constantly been working in the affordable housing business. Working with the city agencies is sometimes difficult business, not risk-free, but is lower risk and lower reward.
Right.
So it's a way to keep our people working in spite of the economic cycles of the city of New York.
And you've also been involved with senior housing.
Well, we got involved in New York City going back in the 90s with a company that was known as Captain Senior Quarters, sold to Atria. We developed the two largest assisted and independent living facilities at that time, one up in Riverdale on the Henry Hudson Parkway, the other one in Queens, in Kew Gardens. After having sold out to what was Atria, ultimately, the evolution of that company, I had a relationship with a friend and a partner in Arizona, and we went very actively into the independent and assisted living business development there, and we own and operate in excess of 1,500 units and continue to build out there.
With a minute and a half less, you're very involved in the community, JNF and other charities. Talk about that.
Well, I mean, it goes without saying, and not to sound trite, if you have been blessed, you owe it to others to help bless them. And I have been blessed both in life and in business, and I was born to a beautiful family. I've been blessed with a beautiful wife and children and extended family. And whatever I can do with what has been given to me to help others, I feel is incumbent, and it's incumbent upon me to teach that to my children. I'm very proud of the fact that they are as involved with me, whether it's in the Jewish National Fund or whether it's St. Mary's Children's Hospital or whether it's my wife's involvement with the Epilepsy Foundation over at New York University and Dr. Davinsky. We're thrilled to be able to help those around us who are not as blessed as we are.
And I'd love to say you are a true friend and a mensch, and thanks for being here today.
Always my pleasure to be with you, Michael. Thank you very much.